The air inside the chamber was electric, a place usually governed by formality now crackling with something raw, something uncontainable. Reporters leaned forward in their seats, cameras already rolling as if they sensed history was about to etch itself into the record. On one side stood Ron DeSantis, jaw tight, voice sharpened like a blade as he spat his words into the microphone. He painted Washington as tyrants, sneered about overreach and fearmongering, his tone more suited to a campaign rally than a discussion of lives lost. Each sentence carried that trademark defiance, the swagger of a man convinced that volume could substitute for truth. And then, without raising his voice, Chuck Schumer cut through the air like thunder. His words landed with the precision of a hammer striking steel. Governor, leadership isn't measured by how loudly you shout about freedom. It's measured by how many lives you save when freedom is under threat. The chamber fell silent. For a beat, it felt as though the oxygen itself had been sucked out of the room. DeSantis blinked, a flicker of hesitation betraying the armor of confidence he wore so tightly. Reporters scrambled, pens scratching, phones buzzing, the moment was already racing beyond the walls, leaping onto Twitter feeds and news alerts across the country. The clash was not just about policy, it was about identity, about who gets to define America in the face of crisis. In Schumer's eyes, you could see the weight of immigrant grandparents who had crossed oceans in search of safety, the burden of families mourning loved ones, the responsibility of a leader refusing to treat tragedy as political theater. And in DeSantis's glare, you saw the calculation of ambition, the willingness to gamble lives for applause lines, to turn suffering into a stage prop. The viral clip would replay on every screen by nightfall. Commentators would marvel at Schumer's composure, the way his voice carried dignity without needing to shout. But in that frozen instant, before the hashtags and headlines, all that mattered was the undeniable truth echoing through the chamber. One man spoke of power, the other of people. But what led to this explosive moment was years in the making. The pandemic was never just about a virus. It was about what kind of nation America was willing to be when tested. Hospitals overflowed, families held vigils over Zoom, and entire cities fell quiet as if holding their breath. Science pleaded for patience, for discipline, for sacrifice. Yet across the country, a different drumbeat echoed, skepticism, suspicion, and the seductive cry of rebellion. In the clash between these two visions of America, the fight for leadership became a fight for the soul of the nation itself. On one side were doctors and public servants who begged for masks, vaccines, and temporary restraint to save lives. They spoke in the sober language of responsibility, reminding the nation that freedom means little if death is at your doorstep. On the other side surged voices who mocked those pleas, who branded caution as weakness, who wrapped defiance in the stars and stripes and declared that to close a bar was to betray the Constitution. For every chart showing lives spared, there was a rally sign screaming about tyranny. It was in this fractured America that Chuck Schumer and Ron DeSantis became avatars of two paths forward. Schumer, with decades of public service behind him, wore the mantle of duty. His message was rooted in order, in science, in the conviction that leadership meant protecting those who could not protect themselves. For him, each statistic was a face, each death a story. His calm was not detachment, but the determination of a man who had seen too much chaos to gamble with more. DeSantis, meanwhile, embraced the role of rebel governor. To him, mandates were shackles, and the virus a stage upon which he could project defiance. He framed himself as the defender of real Americans, the man willing to stare down Washington and say no, even if saying no meant more funerals. His rallies roared with cheers not for policy but for posture. The louder he pushed against the tide of caution, the more he was celebrated by those hungry for a champion who mirrored their anger. This was never a debate confined to chambers and committees. It was Thanksgiving tables torn apart by arguments over masks. It was grocery store confrontations, viral videos of passengers screaming on planes, families choosing between protecting grandparents and attending weddings. Every choice became political, every cough an accusation. The virus had invaded not just bodies, but values, identities, and the very definition of freedom. So when Schumer and DeSantis finally faced one another, it was not merely two men trading barbs. It was the embodiment of America's divide, order versus rebellion, compassion versus calculation, responsibility versus raw ambition. Schumer's every word carried the weight of science and sacrifice. DeSantis's every rebuttal bristled with the energy of defiance, sharpened by the hunger of a man who saw the crisis as a ladder to higher office. And this was the tension that electrified their confrontation. It wasn't about one policy, one mandate, or one speech. It was about who America wanted to be in its darkest hour, the nation that rallied together with dignity, or the nation that splintered into factions chasing applause. The cameras were ready, the microphones hot, the nation's nerves frayed thin. And soon, their words would collide in a way that left the entire country divided. Long before the cameras captured that fiery exchange, Ron DeSantis had already carved out his identity in the pandemic as the governor who would not bow to mandates. Where other leaders reached for caution, DeSantis reached for confrontation. He framed mask requirements as overreach, vaccine campaigns as manipulation, and shutdowns as an unforgivable assault on the heartbeat of Florida's culture. His message was simple, blunt, and repeated at every podium: we choose freedom over fear. Crowds roared whenever he said it. The slogan appeared on signs at rallies, printed on t-shirts, hashtagged across social media. In a moment of national grief, DeSantis offered a performance of defiance. He turned every press conference into a miniature battlefield, waging war against Washington elites and painting himself as the last wall of resistance between Floridians and what he branded as tyranny. To his supporters, he was bold, unflinching, and patriotic. To his critics, he was reckless, callous, and dangerously ambitious. While Floridians packed beaches and stadiums under his watch, the virus spread silently, cutting through nursing homes, schools, and hospitals. Doctors in Miami spoke of overflowing ICUs. Nurses wept outside break rooms, exhausted from holding the hands of dying patients whose families weren't allowed to be there. But at DeSantis's podium, the message remained the same: Florida was open for business, a bastion of liberty in a fearful world. His refusal to shut down bars and restaurants won cheers from business owners but left public health experts begging for mercy. The contradiction grew sharper with every wave. He called himself the defender of freedom while parents buried children who had caught the virus at school. He railed against vaccine mandates while privately encouraging his allies to get their shots. He mocked mask requirements even as his own aides whispered that outbreaks were hitting state offices. Each contradiction was swept aside with the same confident grin, the same soundbite tailored for evening news. The deaths were real, but the performance was louder. And that performance was not accidental. DeSantis's strategy was calibrated for more than Florida. He had his eyes fixed on a larger stage, the national arena. By turning the pandemic into a political theater, he positioned himself as the natural heir to a brand of politics that thrived on confrontation, on turning public health into a battlefield of identity. Every refusal to mandate, every barb against Washington, every photo of a packed stadium was not just governance, it was audition. Yet beneath the applause lines lay a brutal truth: Florida's numbers told a story no slogan could erase. Surging death rates, overwhelmed hospitals, teachers lost in waves of infection, families fractured by grief. His freedom came at a staggering cost. Critics accused him of gambling with lives to score political points, of treating a pandemic as a campaign trail. Supporters countered that he was defending their rights. But even within his base, whispers grew: was this really leadership, or just theater dressed up as courage? The arrogance of his stance was impossible to ignore. At times, it seemed he thrived on provocation itself. The louder the outrage from scientists, the stronger his defiance became. He framed experts as elitists, painted safety measures as submission, and cast himself as the everyman warrior. It was a role he played with relish, but the cracks were visible. Each press conference had the feel of a performance teetering on the edge, held together not by consistency, but by sheer volume. And that is why his clash with Schumer mattered so deeply. DeSantis had built an empire of words, fiery, defiant, and untethered from the human toll. But words alone cannot withstand the weight of truth delivered with calm conviction. He was about to learn that not every opponent could be drowned out with slogans, not every argument dismissed with swagger. Because across the aisle, a veteran statesman was preparing for a fight. Chuck Schumer's story was never about grandeur, but about grit. Born to a family of Jewish immigrants in Brooklyn, he grew up with the unshakable belief that hard work and perseverance could carve out a place in a country that promised opportunity to those who gave their all. His father ran a small exterminating business, his mother was a homemaker who carried the weight of the household. From them, young Chuck inherited not wealth, but values, humility, duty, and a fierce devotion to family. He excelled in school, driven not by privilege but by determination. Harvard accepted him at just 16, a testament to his intellect, but it was in politics where his true calling emerged. Schumer was not the kind of man who sought glamour or celebrity, he built his reputation on pragmatism, on finding solutions even when none seemed obvious. He was the kind of legislator who rolled up his sleeves, sat across the table from rivals, and hammered out deals until something workable emerged. His colleagues, even those who disagreed with him, often remarked on his relentlessness. He didn't walk away until the work was done. Over the decades, that pragmatism became his signature. He wasn't known for fiery speeches or viral soundbites, he was known for delivering results. To the people of New York, Schumer was the steady hand in a storm, the senator who never forgot the struggles of working-class families because he came from one. He carried the lessons of immigrant grandparents who had fled persecution, who had arrived in America with little more than hope. For Schumer, public service was never a stepping stone to power. It was repayment, a way to honor those who had sacrificed so much to make his life possible. That sense of responsibility weighed heavily when the pandemic struck. New York became the first epicenter, its hospitals drowning in cases, its streets eerily silent, its people terrified. Schumer didn't posture, he acted. He fought for federal relief, pushed for funding to keep small businesses alive, demanded protective equipment for doctors and nurses. He spoke often of the elderly trapped in nursing homes, of the immigrant workers keeping subways running and groceries stocked, of the families mourning in isolation. Every number in a health briefing was, to him, a person with a story. He was not perfect, no leader was, but his compass pointed toward protection, not politics. When others minimized the crisis, Schumer amplified the urgency. He knew what it meant to lead in tragedy, and he carried the voices of millions of New Yorkers whose resilience demanded representation. His speeches weren't filled with slogans, they were filled with acknowledgement, the kind of empathy that told frightened citizens, you are seen, you are heard, you matter. In the broader political arena, Schumer became a foil to leaders like DeSantis. Where DeSantis stoked rebellion, Schumer sought steadiness. Where DeSantis wielded freedom as a blunt instrument, Schumer spoke of collective duty, the idea that freedom thrives only when a nation survives together. He reminded audiences that America had faced crises before, wars, depressions, attacks, and had endured not by splintering into factions, but by uniting in shared sacrifice. His message was not glamorous, but it resonated. It was the voice of a man who had weathered storms and knew survival depended on solidarity. Behind the calm exterior was fire. Schumer, after all, was a Brooklyn son, familiar with the rough and tumble of politics, unafraid of confrontation when the stakes demanded it. Yet his style was never to shout down an opponent. His power lay in patience, in carefully choosing words that struck not just the mind but the conscience. Over years of service, he had become a master of the slow burn, the steady build-up, and the precisely timed strike. It was this temperament that made his confrontation with DeSantis so compelling. For decades, Schumer had watched others rise on waves of bluster, only to collapse when their words met the immovable weight of fact. He knew the value of restraint, the impact of silence before a devastating line, the way dignity could pierce louder than arrogance ever could. And beneath his measured tone lay something deeper, memory. The memory of grandparents who had survived persecution, who had taught him that truth was not negotiable. The memory of communities who had endured suffering together in New York. The memory of lives cut short by a virus whose toll demanded honesty, not performance. These were the memories that steadied his voice and anchored his convictions. So when the cameras rolled, and DeSantis hurled his taunts with the confidence of a man rehearsing for applause, Schumer did not flinch. He stood as he always had, grounded, deliberate, unshaken. Because for him, this was not theater. It was duty. And when the moment came, decades of service would fuel a calm yet devastating counterattack. The Senate chamber had grown used to heated exchanges, but on that afternoon the tension was different, sharper, almost combustible. The air hummed with anticipation as cameras lined the back wall, lenses trained on the podium where Chuck Schumer stood, papers in hand. He began with his usual calm cadence, speaking of lives lost, of the duty to safeguard the vulnerable, of a government's responsibility when its people face danger. His words were deliberate, measured, meant to reassure. But the stillness was shattered before he could finish his thought. Ron DeSantis, sitting off to the side as though coiled for the attack, leaned forward and cut in. His voice carried across the room with practiced sharpness. What you call responsibility, Senator, is nothing more than Washington tyranny. You think Americans need a bureaucrat to tell them how to live? Well, in Florida, we trust our people. We don't lock them down. We don't muzzle them with mandates. We respect their freedom. The words echoed, provocative, designed for the cameras as much as for the chamber. A ripple of murmur spread through the reporters clustered in the gallery. Schumer did not look up right away. He held his silence for a beat, eyes fixed on the page before him as if weighing the gravity of interruption itself. But his grip on the podium tightened. DeSantis pressed on, emboldened. He jabbed at the air with his finger, each line more cutting than the last. You call it public safety, but it's control. You say it's about saving lives, but it's about power. While you sit here in Washington dictating rules, families in Florida are working, living, thriving, because we believe in freedom over fear. His words landed with the rhythm of a campaign speech, and supporters watching from afar would no doubt cheer. But inside the chamber, the bravado sounded like defiance against the very reality the nation had lived through. Schumer lifted his head, his gaze steady. He let the governor's words hang in the air, unchallenged for a long moment, as if to expose their hollowness by silence alone. His calmness contrasted so sharply with DeSantis's swagger that the contrast itself became theater. One man boiling with accusation, the other anchored by restraint. Yet there was a flicker in Schumer's eyes, a signal to those who knew him well, the rebuttal was coming. Reporters leaned forward, pens poised. Even some of DeSantis's allies shifted uneasily, sensing that the governor's eagerness had drawn him onto thin ice. Schumer finally spoke, his voice low but unshakable. Governor, no one doubts the value of freedom. But freedom without responsibility is chaos. And chaos, in the middle of a pandemic, costs lives. DeSantis scoffed audibly, shaking his head as though brushing away the point before it could take hold. That's the scare tactic you've peddled from day one. Floridians don't need Washington telling them how to breathe. They know how to live without your permission. Gasps fluttered through the chamber. The tone was brazen, bordering on disrespectful, and DeSantis thrived on it, his lips curling into the faintest smirk. He thought he had cornered Schumer into playing defense. But Schumer did not rush. He did not raise his voice. He stood still, shoulders squared, the gravity of his years in service radiating in the steadiness of his tone. The governor's words may have been designed to rattle, but Schumer was not a man easily rattled. He had weathered storms far larger than political theater. The chamber was hushed now, as though waiting for a verdict. Cameras zoomed tighter. Phones buzzed with live updates. Everyone sensed that the confrontation had reached a knife's edge. The governor had thrown his sharpest barbs, daring Schumer to falter. And then, with the nation watching, the moment everyone remembers unfolded. For a fleeting moment, the chamber seemed frozen in time. DeSantis's words still hung in the air, bold and unapologetic, but silence followed, thick, heavy, almost unbearable. The governor leaned back, chin lifted in defiance, as though daring his opponent to answer. Cameras clicked relentlessly, capturing every twitch of the senators' faces, every shift in posture. Then, Chuck Schumer leaned slightly forward over the podium, one hand gripping the edge as if anchoring himself to the weight of history. His voice, when it came, was low and deliberate, so calm that it cut sharper than any shout could. "Governor," he began, his eyes locked on DeSantis, "you speak of freedom as though it exists in a vacuum. But freedom is not the right to endanger your neighbor. Freedom is not the right to gamble with other people's lives. Freedom without responsibility is not liberty, it's negligence." A murmur rippled across the chamber. DeSantis shifted in his chair, his smirk thinning. Reporters leaned forward, pens scratching furiously as the energy shifted. Schumer paused, letting the words linger. He knew the silence was as powerful as the sound. Then, with the precision of a man who had spent decades in the public arena, he began to stack his case piece by piece, each fact like a brick forming an unshakable wall. When the pandemic struck, Schumer continued, his voice steady, our nation was faced with a question: do we stand together, protect one another, and endure the hardship as one people, or do we fracture, pretend we are islands, and let the most vulnerable pay the price? He let his gaze sweep across the chamber, past senators, past aides, straight into the lenses of the cameras broadcasting live. The numbers do not lie. Florida saw spikes that filled hospitals to breaking point. Nurses begged for relief. Families were forced to say goodbye to loved ones over a phone screen because precautions were dismissed as politics. That is not freedom. That is tragedy born of denial. The governor shifted again, his jaw tightening. He muttered something under his breath, but the microphones caught only fragments. Schumer pressed on, unshaken. You say Floridians were living, thriving, Schumer said, his cadence rising, deliberate, like the slow strike of a drum. But Governor, what about the thousands who weren't? What about the ICU wards where doctors worked double shifts until their hands trembled? What about the families who buried mothers, fathers, children, because leadership told them a mask was too much to ask? Gasps swept through the room. A few senators exchanged wide-eyed looks. DeSantis's confidence, so bold moments ago, seemed to waver under the sheer weight of lived reality Schumer was invoking. The cameras clicked louder now, as though feeding on the drama. Clips were already being uploaded, tweets firing off in real time. Schumer dismantles DeSantis live, one journalist typed furiously. Schumer leaned back slightly, giving space before his next strike. His voice dropped again, soft but razor-sharp. Governor, you love to talk about freedom. But let me tell you what freedom looks like to the family who lost their child when schools reopened too soon. Let me tell you what freedom means to the nurse who held the hand of a dying stranger because loved ones were barred from the room. Freedom, Governor, means nothing to the grave. The line hit like a hammer. Audible gasps rippled through the gallery. DeSantis blinked hard, his jaw clenching. For the first time that afternoon, the governor looked rattled. Schumer pressed his advantage. His words now carried a rhythm, a cadence that felt inevitable, like dominoes falling in a line. You call Washington heavy-handed. I call it doing what leaders must when lives are at stake. You call it overreach. I call it compassion. You call it tyranny. I call it responsibility. He paused again, allowing the repetition to echo. The chamber was utterly still, hanging on each syllable. And Governor, Schumer said, leaning forward, his voice rising with the weight of decades in public service, when you strip away the slogans, when you strip away the soundbites, what remains is this: leadership is not about playing to the crowd. It is not about clinging to ideology. It is about protecting the people you serve, even when it costs you politically, even when it's hard, even when it makes you unpopular. That is leadership. That is duty. That is America. The words landed like a gavel strike. For a long moment, there was silence. No one dared move. Even the clicking of cameras slowed, as if the room itself was holding its breath. DeSantis opened his mouth to respond, but the attempt faltered. His usual crispness dulled, his reply more defensive than defiant. You can twist numbers all you want," he stammered, his voice lacking its earlier fire. "Floridians know the truth." But the words didn't soar. They sank. Schumer's eyes never wavered. He let the governor's weakened rebuttal hang limply before speaking again, this time, not as a partisan warrior, but as a man appealing to something greater. "We will debate policy, Governor. We will disagree, loudly, often, fiercely. But I will never apologize for fighting to save lives. And history will not apologize for remembering who stood for people and who stood for politics." That final line echoed through the chamber like thunder. Gasps gave way to murmurs, then to the frantic chorus of reporters whispering, typing, broadcasting. The counterattack was complete. Calm. Measured. Devastating. In the gallery, a journalist whispered to a colleague, "That was the moment. That's the clip that'll be everywhere by tonight." And indeed, within minutes, snippets of Schumer's remarks were already viral on social media, shared with captions like, "Schumer shuts down DeSantis," and "the mic drop heard around the country." DeSantis sat rigid, jaw clenched, eyes narrowing as though calculating how to reclaim the ground he had lost. But the chamber knew what it had just witnessed. The momentum had shifted, irreversibly. Schumer gathered his papers, sliding them neatly into a folder as though the confrontation had been no more than routine business. But the deliberate calmness of that gesture only underscored the drama. The nation had just seen not only an exchange of words but a clash of philosophies, laid bare in front of cameras, dissected in real time across every platform. And as Schumer stepped back from the podium, reporters shouted questions, aides scrambled, the hum of the chamber roared back to life. But his message had already landed. His words would replay on every news channel, every feed, every timeline. It felt like an ending, but it was only the beginning. Because as sharp as the counterattack had been, the real battle would rage far beyond that chamber. The chamber had barely cleared when the shockwaves began rippling outward. Within minutes, phones buzzed across the country, clips of Schumer's rebuttal spreading like wildfire. On Twitter, the hashtag #SchumerStrikesBack shot to the top of trending charts, overtaking celebrity scandals and even sports scores. For once, politics wasn't just dry policy, it was theater, it was justice, it was validation in real time. The first wave came from everyday citizens. People who had buried loved ones during the darkest months of the pandemic wrote messages of gratitude, saying Schumer had finally spoken what they had screamed into the void for years. "Thank you for saying what we couldn't," one post read, accompanied by a picture of a father lost to COVID. "This isn't just politics. It's survival." Thousands echoed the sentiment, turning the hashtag into a living archive of grief and vindication. But almost as quickly came the memes. Clips of DeSantis's rattled expression, the brief flicker of doubt across his face, were looped and set to dramatic soundtracks. Some turned his stammer into auto-tuned remixes. Others froze the moment Schumer delivered his piercing line and captioned it with phrases like, "checkmate," and, "freedom meets facts." For a younger audience who consumed politics less through speeches and more through digital spectacle, this was the ultimate form of civic theater. Cable news anchors were not far behind. CNN rolled out a panel dissecting every word, calling it a turning point in the pandemic debate. MSNBC commentators framed it as proof that truth, though battered, could still land a knockout punch. Even the New York Times ran a headline that morning, "Schumer's strike, a Senate showdown reverberates." Across the aisle, conservative outlets scrambled. Fox News commentators tried to spin the exchange as political grandstanding, but even their replay of the clip couldn't mask the weight of the moment. The visual contrast, Schumer's steady calm against DeSantis's visible unease, did most of the storytelling. Late-night comedians seized their chance. Stephen Colbert quipped, "If that wasn't a mic drop, someone please get Chuck Schumer an actual microphone." Trevor Noah replayed the footage with a slow zoom on DeSantis's face, joking, "That's the exact moment he realized freedom doesn't cure viruses." The laughter reinforced the divide. For some, it was catharsis, for others, it was salt in the wound. Celebrities added fuel. Lin-Manuel Miranda tweeted, "History has its eyes on you." Tonight, they saw truth. Actress Kerry Washington praised Schumer's poise, while Mark Ruffalo urged followers to never forget who stood for science and who gambled with lives. Their words reached millions who might never watch a Senate debate but would retweet their heroes' endorsements. Yet beneath the noise, the deeper resonance was undeniable. Schumer had not only checked an opponent, he had crystallized a moral divide. To his supporters, he became the embodiment of sober responsibility, the adult in the room who dared to remind the nation that freedom without accountability leads to tragedy. To his critics, he was the nagging voice of government intrusion. The clash didn't resolve America's divisions, it spotlighted them, raw and exposed, for everyone to see. Pollsters soon measured the fallout. Overnight surveys showed a spike in public approval for Schumer's handling of the pandemic response. Among independents, especially suburban voters weary of political chaos, his calm command struck a chord. Meanwhile, DeSantis's defenders doubled down, flooding right-wing forums with declarations that their governor had stood against tyranny. The polarization deepened, but the spotlight lingered where Schumer had aimed it, on the stakes of leadership in crisis. What made the moment endure wasn't just the instant virality, but the sense of cultural reckoning it unleashed. For immigrant families who had long felt the brunt of the pandemic, working frontline jobs, losing relatives abroad, Schumer's words carried an almost personal resonance. He, the grandson of immigrants, stood tall against a narrative that dismissed their sacrifices. For progressives, it was identity meeting principle, a reminder that their struggles, their grief, and their pride had a voice in the highest halls of power. The more critics tried to downplay it, the bigger the moment became. Attempts to mock Schumer's delivery as scripted only highlighted how precise it had been. Claims that DeSantis had been ambushed rang hollow against the video evidence of his own bravado faltering in real time. The story refused to die, cycling from one news cycle to the next, morphing into op-eds, viral TikToks, and even high school debate references. By the week's end, the showdown had become more than a headline. It was a cultural touchstone, the kind of moment replayed in classrooms, quoted in sermons, and referenced in union halls. For supporters, it was proof that facts still had a fighting chance. For detractors, it was a rallying cry against what they saw as elite arrogance. Either way, it had struck a national nerve. And yet, the question lingered, what would happen when the echo faded? Because as powerful as Schumer's counterattack had been, the forces it challenged, the defiance, the skepticism, the raw political ambition, were far from defeated. The chamber may have erupted in gasps that day, but outside its walls, the battle for America's future had only just begun. In the end, it was never just about Chuck Schumer versus Ron DeSantis. It was never just about a fiery exchange in front of the cameras or the millions of tweets that followed. This clash, this single viral moment, carried something deeper, a truth that reached beyond politics and into the very soul of America. Schumer's words lingered not because they were sharp, but because they were rooted in something timeless, the belief that leadership is not about vanity, but about duty. America had been through hell. Families torn apart, loved ones lost, hospitals overwhelmed. In those moments, the country needed leaders who didn't treat life like a gamble, who didn't weigh human safety against poll numbers. Schumer embodied the counterweight to that reckless calculation. He showed that even in a divided age, truth and responsibility could cut through the noise. His calm rebuttal to DeSantis was more than just politics, it was a reminder that facts matter, that science saves lives, that compassion is not weakness but strength. DeSantis's defiance might have energized a base hungry for rebellion, but history has always judged rebellion differently when it comes at the cost of lives. His slogans of freedom rang hollow against the quiet suffering of families watching ventilators breathe for their loved ones. His bravado may have won headlines, but it was Schumer's steady voice that gave people something far more powerful, reassurance that leadership still had meaning. This was the moral core of the battle. Leadership, at its essence, is not about standing tallest in a room or spitting the fiercest soundbite. Leadership is about absorbing the weight of responsibility and carrying it for others. It is about making choices that might anger the loudest few, but ultimately protect the quiet many. Schumer understood that. His entire career, born from the immigrant spirit of striving and sacrifice, prepared him for that very moment. And the lesson extended beyond two men locked in political combat. It was a lesson for a nation fractured and exhausted, searching for hope. Dignity triumphs over arrogance. Truth triumphs over spectacle. Sacrifice triumphs over selfish gain. America cannot heal when leaders treat crises like campaign props. It heals when leaders remind people that their lives, their stories, and their struggles matter more than polls and podiums. The Schumer DeSantis clash etched itself into memory not only because of the drama, but because it revealed a contrast America desperately needed to see. On one side, a governor turning a pandemic into a stage play of bravado. On the other, a senator who used his platform not to grandstand, but to remind people of their shared humanity. The applause, the memes, the headlines, they were fleeting. What endured was the sense that integrity, when wielded at the right moment, can shift the tide of history. And so the moral was clear: when arrogance seeks to divide, dignity must rise. When slogans threaten to drown out science, truth must roar louder. When politics tempts leaders to choose ambition over lives, the people must demand better. Schumer's strike was not the end of a feud, it was a beginning, a spark of clarity in an age of noise. Because in the end, leadership is not measured in soundbites or viral clips. It is measured in lives protected, in truths defended, in a nation held together when it threatens to split apart. And that is why, when the cameras turned off and the tweets faded, Schumer's words still echoed. Not as a partisan jab, but as a call to remember who we are at our best, a country that chooses dignity over arrogance, science over slogans, unity over division. And that call still waits for its answer. And so, the clash that began as Chuck Schumer versus Ron DeSantis became something far bigger than a political sparring match. It wasn't just about who delivered the sharper line, or who won the room in that single moment. No, this debate revealed more than politics. It revealed America at a crossroads. On one side, the pull of arrogance dressed up as freedom, short-term games played with long-term consequences. On the other, the steady insistence that truth, science, and responsibility still matter, that leadership isn't about stroking egos, but about safeguarding lives. That was the real weight of the exchange. And here's where it matters most, not just in the halls of power, but in how you respond. Every clip shared, every conversation sparked, every moment of reflection moves us closer to deciding what kind of nation we want to be. Will we let the loudest slogans drown out the quiet truth, or will we demand better, from our leaders, from our media, and from ourselves? That's why we tell these stories. To remind you that the fight for truth doesn't end when the cameras cut or the hashtags fade. It continues in living rooms, in classrooms, in the choices each of us makes. So if this resonated with you, make sure to subscribe, share this video, and keep the conversation alive. Because the more voices we gather, the stronger this movement for truth, dignity, and unity becomes. And remember this final beat, the line that should echo long after the debate is forgotten. Because in the end, dignity doesn't just win arguments, it wins history.